Good evening, everyone. Uh, on behalf of Catholic Theological Union, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Decolonizing Interreligious Studies and Dialogue. Some of you at least know for sure, but CTU was born actually in the wake of Vatican II, a moment of renewal and openness that reshaped the Church's relationship in the world. Among the Council's most transformative texts, Nostra Aetate charted a new course for dialogue and collaboration between the Church and non-Christian communities. This year, we actually mark the 60th anniversary of that groundbreaking document, a time to celebrate its legacy and also to reflect on where this journey of dialogue is leading us next. Interreligious engagement has always been part of CTU's DNA, I would say. From its earliest days, CTU sought to embody Vatican II's spirit of encounter and openness. This commitment found an enduring champion, especially in Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, whose vision for reconciliation, dialogue, and what he called the consistent ethic of life continues to inspire our mission still today. And our Bernardin Center reflects this legacy, one rooted in the conviction that genuine faith seeks understandings across boundaries. And yet, as tonight's program reminds us, the work of dialogue is never finished. While Nostra Aetate opened doors, we now face new and necessary questions. And so I'll put actually to the guest my questions now. What colonial assumptions have shaped how we study and practice interreligious engagement? And how can we move forward approaches that are more just, inclusive, and truly transformative? Our guest will be introduced to us by Said, and thank you, Said, for actually for doing this, and thank you, Peter, for taking care of the technical part. Um, I just want to remind something that also Pope Francis said. Authentic interreligious dialogue is not a luxury. It is essential for building peace and fraternity. And his words remind us then that dialogue must go way beyond tolerance. It's much more. It must lead us to solidarity and shared transformation. So as we begin, let us listen deeply, engage courageously, and continue the work of building bridges that reflect both the spirit of Vatican II and the prophetic vision of Cardinal Bernardin. Thank you all, and I give the word to Said.
Thank you so much, President Enzo Del Bracco, for your opening remarks. Good evening, everybody. My name is Saeed Atif Rizwan, and I am Assistant Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies and Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies program here at Catholic Theological Union. The Catholic Muslim Studies program, CMSP, as I like to say, is really grounded in not only Nostra Aetate, but in the world in which we live, in which there are so many cultural and religious variations. And so the idea of understanding each other isn't just important, it's essential. And the CMSP is not just about learning, it's about doing. And so the courses and the programs that the CMSP offers go beyond the classroom. And the hope I have as director of the program is to allow that knowledge to be not only transformative, but be converted into action and help to bridge gaps between communities, spark meaningful conversations, and allow people to understand one another in more nuanced ways. And tonight's program is a continuing legacy to Nostra Aetate, in that Nostra Aetate, as President Del Bracco said, really set the shape of the church and the ways in which it interacts with non-Christian communities. Of course, there are many good willed people and what they hope to accomplish in interreligious studies as well as interreligious dialogue. I feel like, and as many others do, including the wonderful scholars that we have here today, is that we have to now think about how to do interreligious dialogue in ways that don't perpetuate systems that have been used to colonize, or as well as to marginalize people that may not belong to a class that shares power with those that are in fact in power. And so with that, I don't want to talk too much and really and move the conversation to our speakers. And before doing so, what I would like to advise everybody is that For those who may have questions, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the program. You can put your question in the Zoom chat box, and myself or the moderator, Peter Cunningham, will receive it, and then we can transmit that question to the panelist if you're feeling shy or you just don't want to talk. But for those who would like to directly engage the panelist, I would invite you and encourage you to raise your hand and then unmute. We will help you unmute and to start your video stream, and you can directly engage the panels as well. Please note that this program is being recorded and that it will be put up on our C2 website for those who would be interested in revisiting what is discussed today. I will first introduce the two speakers and then hand it over to the first one. One of our speakers tonight is Dr. Kyunju Christine Pei, and she is professor of religious ethics and women's and gender studies and chair of the religion department at Denison University in Ohio. She's trained as a social ethicist and teaches and researches ethics of peace and war, transnational feminist ethics and theologies, spiritual activism, and U.S. military prostitution industries in Asia. Her emerging research is the Global Alliance of Christian Zionism. She is the author of the book titled A Trans-Pacific Imagination of Theology, Ethics, and Spiritual Activism, Doing Feminist Ethics Transnationally, which came out in 2003. And she's the co-editor of Embodying Anti-racist Christianity, Asian American Theological Resources for Just Racial Relations, as well as Searching for the Future in the Past, Reclaiming Feminist Theology Visions. Dr. Christine Pei is an Episcopal priest. Dr. Oludamini Ogunaike, he is Associate Professor of African Religious Thought and Democracy at University of Virginia. His research examines the philosophical and artistic dimensions of post-colonial, colonial, and pre-colonial Islamic and indigenous religious traditions of West and North Africa, especially Sufism and Ifa. He is the author of the book titled Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing in Sufism and Ifa, Two West African Intellectual Traditions, which came out in 2020, and it was the winner of the Outstanding First Book Prize of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. And he's also the author of Poetry in Praise of Prophetic Perfection, West African Madih Poetry and Its Precedents. And this came out in 2020. He has recently begun a project on Sufi poetry and poetic knowledge and is working on manuscripts on Yoruba mythology, Islamic philosophy in pre-colonial West Africa, and Afro-Caribbean and African Islamic decolonial thought and praxis. So, as I noted, incredible scholars here with us tonight. So first, I will turn it over to Dr. Pei to deliver her opening remarks. Christine?
Thank you, Said, for your generous introduction to me. And then also thank you, CTU, for having me this evening. And perhaps, so good evening and good morning, depending on where you are. As a Christian social ethicist specializing in transnational feminist ethics and ethics of peace and war, I approach interreligious dialogue questioning how dialogue can enhance peace and justice from interpersonal relations to international relations. So indeed, peace is the most significant issue in our time. Our world suffers from militarized violence in immigration, race in the United States, gender-based violence across the globe, armed conflict, gun violence, war, genocide, ecocide, and the callous free market system. All these forms of violence risk the livelihood of globally disenfranchised populations, including the marginalized in the United States. At the turn of the 21st century, a Swiss Catholic theologian, Hans Koing, called for a global ethic of peace and justice. He asserted there could be no human life together without a world ethic for the nations and that there could be no peace among nations without peace among the religions fostered by dialogue among religions. His emphasis on international collaboration and solidarity has been a mantra for interreligious dialogue for some time. However, a German Catholic woman theologian, Ursula King, argues that Queen's noble principles for overcoming the violence of war have been pronounced without any attention to gender differences, nor do they make clear that dialogue always happens between individual people and members of communities, not between religions as such. Despite their good intentions, in my view, Coyne's declaration of global ethic and King's feminist critique still operate within the neoliberal and neocolonial model without critically interrogating the power differential among different religious groups. So let me unpack what I mean by this. So Coyne's global ethic works only within the assumption of liberal democracy. A liberal democracy as a political system operates on the assumption that rational human beings who respect democratic rules civilly participate in dialogue. However, as an ethicist, what I learned is human beings are as rational as irrational. Even if we agree with Coyne's call for interreligious dialogue for global peace, we cannot enter dialogue without addressing trauma and visceral feelings associated with colonial violence, war, and continued extractive capitalism. Furthermore, genuine interreligious dialogue is almost impossible without dismantling epistemic violence against non-Christian religions deeply ingrained in Western civilization. A liberal approach to interreligious dialogue is naive, if not rhetorical. And Coyne's call for interreligious dialogue assumes that religion is a source of conflict rather than of compassion, empathy, and peace building. His phrase, "there is no peace between nations without dialogue between religions," reminds me of Samuel Huntington's notion of clash of civilizations. Both Coyne and Huntington reduced religion to a nation or civilization without recognizing intra-diversity and intra-conflict within a religious community because of colonial history, race, gender, class, and geopolitics. In these two scholars' minds, non-Christian religions, particularly Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, are considered radically different cultures, and thus the followers of these religions cannot be ruled or civilized in a liberal democracy. If so, what is the purpose of interreligious dialogue from this assumption? Simply to reinforce the value of liberal democracy without critical attention to colonialism embedded in this system. Then how has interreligious dialogue been organized in a liberal democracy? It happens on the mere surface of religious pluralism or religious tolerance as a virtue of liberal democracy. This kind of dialogue is detached from the realities of globally disenfranchised people who may experience religiously justified violence every day, or who may find hope and resilience in their everyday religious practices and encounters with the sacred. A decolonial interreligious dialogue must attend to the material realities of globally disenfranchised people. It should be powerful enough to change these realities. As Ursula King asserts, interreligious dialogue should take gender differences seriously. However, we cannot simply ignore how various religious traditions have been used to reinforce gender-based violence and heteropatriarchy across the globe. At the same time, gender does not exist as an independent category, but always intersects with other identity markers such as sexuality, race, class, disability, and more. When we bring gender into interreligious dialogue, we should be careful not to reproduce the binary gender system or treat all women as victims of patriarchal religious traditions. And post-colonial feminist scholar Chandra Mohanty criticizes well-intended Western feminists for portraying women of color in a post-colonial world as victims of their own religious traditions. Therefore, these Western feminists reproduce the savior complex, like brown women should be saved from brown men precisely from their religious traditions. The Western savior complex perpetuates colonialism and neocolonialism. In fact, gender-based violence and compulsory heteropatriarchy are not unique to religious women of color and colonized women. White women, genderqueers, and even cisgender men have experienced gender-based violence and heteropatriarchal oppression. And gender-based violence has occurred across the globe, regardless of religious differences and different political systems, while this violence is historically specific and contextually distinctive. As Black feminist Christian ethicist Tracy West accentuates, the United States has not made much progress in ending gender-based violence compared to other countries. Neither have Christian communities. This saddens me so deeply. Additionally, paying attention to gender differences in interreligious dialogue should not ignore how women, men, and non-gender binary people have been in solidarity resisting militarized violence beyond their differences in gender and sexual identities. So a decolonial way of interreligious dialogue requires critically interrogating militarized violence, extractive capitalism, and trauma resulting from colonial violence, not as a background, but as a matrix of interreligious dialogue. So interreligious dialogue does not happen in a bubble, but always responds to political, social, and cultural context. For this reason, interreligious dialogue is not value neutral, but political. But what is political does not necessarily mean a power struggle. Instead, by recognizing the political matrix surrounding interreligious dialogue, we can explore how to create just and shared power relations. Also, diversifying the methods of interreligious dialogue is a critical step toward decolonizing the dialogue. Dialogue doesn't need to happen through spoken words or prioritize language-based communication. We need different perspectives on and methods for dialogue. A decolonial scholar, Marcena Gomez Barris, elaborates on the concept of submerged perspectives as a decolonial practice of seeing life differently. Submerged perspectives are forms of knowing and being that persist beneath the surface of colonial order. So vernacular, indigenous, and feminist practices hint at submerged perspectives, making micro spaces of resistance and relational life and offering the groundwork for decolonial futures. Submerged perspectives on interreligious dialogue challenge us to look deeply into what ordinary people have been doing, cracking the colonial order, and into the rituals and spiritual practices that are embodied there. Interreligious dialogue practiced in the cracks of the colonial order may take multiple forms of art, dance, walking meditation, silent meditation, poetry, rituals, and more. And all these forms can create new ways of dialogue. Finally, when engaging with interreligious dialogue, we should critically reflect on whether we reproduce American exceptionalism, extract knowledge and wisdom from religious others, and use the logics of neoliberal capitalism that merely celebrates and exoticizes religious differences. And I would like to have more conversation about American exceptionalism as practiced in interreligious dialogue, particularly in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'll turn it over to you, Oladumini.
Thank you very much, Christine. That was great. Thanks very much to Sayed Atif, Professor Rizwan, for inviting me, to President El Braco for staying up late and hanging with us and hosting this event, and all of you for coming out on a Tuesday night or a Wednesday morning, wherever it may be. So I've been asked to talk about decolonization and interreligious dialogue. So the two things, I like to define our terms so we're clear what we know what we're talking about. We'll start with the interreligious dialogue. This current round of people in different religious traditions have been talking to each other, dialoguing forever, right? As long as there have been people, they've been talking. This current form of interreligious dialogue, though, we can kind of trace back to actually something that happened in Chicago, where a lot of you are, 1893, the Parliament of World Religions. Right, so this happened in 1893, and this kind of kicked off this most recent modern era of interreligious dialogue. And at the end of all of this, in which you had Swami Vivekananda coming from Europe, you had delegates from Japan, you had people coming from lots of different places, you even had 2 African American delegates, no Native Americans though, no Native Americans. And when the Parliament concluded, Reverend Barrows, one of the organizers and hosters of the event, reflected, and he said this: "Religion, like the white light of heaven, has been broken into many colored fragments by the prisms of men. One of the objects of the Parliament of Religions has been to change this many colored radiance back into the white light of heavenly truth." Right? Sounds beautiful, sounds rainbows, sounds really nice. Unfortunately, as many scholars, including some actual participants at that very parliament, pointed out, this white light was often more like white out. Instead of coming together of colors that illuminates things, it's erasing differences and particularities, and not attending to issues of justice. So at the parliament, or just 3 years before the parliament, is when there was the massacre at Wounded Knee. Chief Sitting Bull had just been arrested and executed, and no Native Americans were invited at all to the parliament. The 2 African American delegates, one of whom was Frederick Douglass, called the white city that had been built in Chicago, he called it a whitened sepulcher for blacks, a tomb, given the state of race relations in Chicago at the time. Fanny Berrier Williams said that it's a monstrous thing that nearly 1/2 of the so-called evangelical churches of this country repudiate and haughtily deny fellowship to every Christian lady and gentleman happening to be of African descent. She challenged Christians to take seriously their own religion. Another challenge came from a Japanese delegate who said, saw the signs in the US, no Japanese is allowed to enter here. And he said, if such be Christian ethics, we are perfectly satisfied to remain heathen. So there were challenges in the parliament. But as Tomoko Masuzawa, another Japanese scholar, wrote, in fact, the subtitle of her book is How European Universalism Was Preserved in the Language of Pluralism. Right? So the idea that everyone has these different religions, that Hinduism is a religion, Buddhism is a religion. This language, if you know something of Hinduism itself, or even of Buddhist traditions, it's a European universal imposition category upon those traditions. There are different dharmic universalisms. The Sanatana Dharma from the Indian tradition is a very different kind of universalism. Hinduism itself doesn't understand itself as a single tradition. It's loads of different, maybe what we could call religions. Similarly, one of the traditions I work on, Orisha worship in Yoruba traditions, it's often called traditional Yoruba religion, but my brother, who's also a scholar of it, says it's like the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It's not Yoruba, nor traditional, nor a religion. It's in Yoruba, it's called Esin, which is a form of worship. Everybody has their form of worship. Esin, people can belong to multiple forms of worship at the same time. It operates in a way very different from the category of religion. So this idea that there are these different religions that different people belong to, that is a particular idea coming out of Europe and Euro-America at a particular time. Even the term religion itself, if you go back to Latin, religio means something very different. It's like the family, for the Romans, it's like a family custom thing. It has a very different meaning. So there's this particular formation that was then imposed on everybody else. So this this has remained an issue in interreligious dialogue. That is, the price of the ticket for engaging in interreligious dialogue is to conduct that dialogue not in your mother tongue, that is, not in the language, the categories, the terms of your tradition, but in the terms of the host. And the host, for the reasons we'll get to later with coloniality, is Euro-American Christianity or post-Christian secularity. That's the host. Those are the categories. Those are the terms, the genres, the modes of discourse. Right? People aren't getting up there and reciting a qasida in Arabic, or haikus, or doing a dance, a sacred dance, as a form of. You could, and this happens, as Professor Pei said, on the vernacular level, the unofficial level. But an official interreligious, the kind inaugurated by this World Parliament, that's not what's happening. We have dialogues that are lectures, articles, and things like that follow a particular format, that use particular kinds of arguments, particular kinds of categories, and particular kinds of languages that are not universal. They're particular. The problem is they make pretensions to universality. It's a particular that overrepresents itself as if it were universal. And this is a huge problem. For a particular to get away with presenting itself to itself and to others as a universal, usually that involves a lot of homogenizing violence. The things that don't fit have to be either tucked away, hidden away, or erased off the scene. Now, this is, as many decolonial scholars like Sylvia Wynter and others have pointed out, this elevation of or pretense of a particular to the category of the universal, and then the homogenizing violence to make that look plausible. Everybody from Du Bois to Fanon to Wynter has pointed it out. This is at the root of the dynamics of coloniality or colonialism. Now, so what do we mean by colonialism and coloniality? Fanon was one of the first people to describe this. Describes the colonial world as a Manichaean world divided between colonizer and colonized, governor and governed, and these categories are mutually co-constitutive. Right? He says the colonizer creates the colonized. Right? You can only be a colonizer, superior, if there's a person who's inferior to you. So you need someone who's inferior. Right? They exist in a relation of mutual co-constitution. Colonizer, colonized, governed, governor, governed. Thought about, the thinking one, the one who's thought about. The one who makes the rules, the one who has to follow the rules. And ultimately alive and dead. Now, coloniality, right? Colonialism is supposed to be over, right? In 1930, there were 77 countries. Now there are 195 countries, right? So a lot of countries got their independence, right? Why are people still complaining, right? Well, yeah, President Del Baco, yeah, kind of. Got independence. What happens is a lot of the same political, economic, institutional, academic knowledge structures maintain. One flag goes down, another flag goes up, and the game stays the same. The players change only slightly, but the game stays the same. In fact, in many cases, it gets even worse. Right? It gets much worse. In African countries in particular, it gets the colonial dynamics get much worse. So early African leaders and other people called this neocolonialism. Later Latin American thinkers called it coloniality. But the idea is the game stays the same. The power relations stay the same. The economic relations stay the same or worsen, and even the psychological things stay the same or get even worse. So theorists of this divide this coloniality up into three dimensions, just for kind of purposes of talking about it. There's coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of power, and coloniality of being. So coloniality of knowledge means certain positions and traditions are thought from and others are thought about, right? Whose categories, terms, genres, languages, and institutions, in which of those is knowledge expressed and validated? Right, so if I have, let's say, if I have an initiation from a babalawo, a traditional priest in Nigeria, that can't get me any job, any credential anywhere. Those forms of knowledge are not valued. The relationship between those forms of knowledge and the forms of knowledge and validation that I have from being a graduate of XYZ university in the US or Europe massive imbalance between the relationship between those forms of knowledge. Right? Not that one is way better than another. Like even Huntington admitted in his class of civilization, he's like, the West didn't win because its ideas are better. It won because it was better at organizing violence. Non-Western people seldom forget this. Western people almost always do. Right? That's Huntington himself. This is no bleeding heart liberal who says it. So this is coloniality of knowledge. Who's thought about, who's thinking, which positions and traditions are institutionally valued and are seen as valid sources of knowledge and critique and ideas, etc., and which are those objects of study. Now, that's coloniality of knowledge. Now there's coloniality of power. Is who's shaping the landscape of options? Or it's quite simply, who's got all the money and guns? Right? Who's got all the money and guns, and who's making it so that you have to decide between, okay, I mean, we see this all the time in terms of African leaders get knocked off anytime they say, okay, we're going to nationalize something, we're going to try to keep the wealth at home. Within a year, assassinated, coup, something happens. Right? And then they get replaced by somebody more friendly. Right? So who is shaping the landscape of options that people have, that countries have, that communities have? Another way, one of my colleagues at Georgetown is a philosopher, says, people rarely ask what values do Madagascar and Bangladesh think should shape global politics. But people ask all the time, what values do the US and China think should shape global politics? The reason is coloniality of power. Some countries, they have the power, their opinions matter, others don't. Or in a more kind of micro example, people never ask, how can we get prisoners to unlearn their unfair stereotypes of wardens? But we ask all the time, how can we unlearn our unfair stereotypes of Black people, Muslims, immigrants, etc.? So Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture once said, if somebody wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, then it becomes my problem. The problem is power. The problem is the imbalance of power and the colonial way in which that's constructed. The people who colonized and their descendants of various hues and backgrounds, but if you're in the system, right, if you've made it to the upper middle class, whatever level, you benefit from those power relations on the backs of those who are oppressed by them, literally oppressed. I mean, there's economists have even done this in 2015. It's probably worse now. For every $1 the global South got in aid, $24 came out in terms of extraction. That was in 2014. It's probably even worse now. Okay, so then there's the third dimension, coloniality of being, which is really like psychology and fancy term ontology, but it's like what it feels like. All right, so Du Bois famously talked about the double consciousness. It's like to be a Black American is to, you know yourself in yourself, but then also to be constantly dealing with the understanding of yourself as other, as lack, as less than human. Right, so you relate to yourself as other. To yourself, you're in the center. All of us, you know, naturally we're like the center of the world, in a certain, problematically or unproblematically. But then you also have a view of yourself if you're minoritized in whatever way, colonized, as periphery, as other, as subhuman, as not worthy, as not valued. Conversely, and again, going back to this mutual co-constitution, if you're on the other side of the colonial divide, you have a sense of yourself as the bee's knees, the pinnacle, the end of the culmination of history, the vanguard of the vanguard, right? This is what the people talk, the inheritors of Western civilization, all of this rhetoric. Hegel famously said, Europe is the land of the elevation of the particular to the universal. He literally just, he gave away the whole game there. Emmanuel Levinas, another famous philosopher, French, said, humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks. All the rest can be translated. All the rest, the exotic, is just dance. He meant that pejoratively, right? And that's how he actually experienced the world, right? The world is just the Bible and the Greeks. Everything else is just dance. I'm at the center. Everything else is exotic. And he experienced that, again, by pushing people and traditions to the periphery. He made himself feel like he was in the center. Or the simplest example you see this is like, there's ethnic food and there's food. Right? Obviously, all food is ethnic food, but due to certain reasons of coloniality, some get labeled ethnic, some are regular. Western education is seen as just education. Everything else is religious training, traditional something. Western civilization is just civilization. Western history is just history. Philosophy, clothing, all of this stuff, right? The universal is experienced. The particular, if it's Western, is experienced as a universal. And this is coloniality of being. Right? And so these three kinds of coloniality still trouble, haunt, determine, undermine interreligious dialogue. And you can see this when you have dialogue that is either like South-South dialogue, like between colonized peoples, or in pre-colonial times, when you have dialogue between people of more equal power relations. So one of the most famous examples in Islamic history is the Mongols came and killed loads of people in the Islamic world. And then the Mongols were like, all right, we need to choose one of the Mongols, actually several different Mongol leaders did this. Like, all right, we want to choose a religion. So they said, everybody send your best religious representatives. We're going to have a big debate in a tent. And whoever won the debate, the Mongol leader would choose. So granted, they were doing it on the Mongol terms, but because the Mongols had wiped out everybody, all of the participants in the debates, none of whom were Mongols, were all kind of on equal footing. They were all terrified of the Mongols. They were all trying to make their best arguments. So that's a different model of interfaith dialogue that doesn't have these same dynamics, right? They weren't coming and trying to make themselves legible to the Mongols on Mongol terms. I'll stop there. I have a lot more to say, but I think that's good for now. I look forward to talking with you more.
Yes.
Thanks.
A lot to chew on. Couple of questions didn't come in, and those who may want to just digest what both, Dr. Ogunaike and Dr. Pei have said, can do so, and certainly please raise your hand if you may be interested in asking a question directly. And if, like I said, if you're shy and you just want to, ask through the chat, that's perfectly okay as well. But before opening up to Q&A, I just thought that give an opportunity for Dr. Pei and Dr. Ogunaike to respond to one another. Is there anything that jumped at you, Dr. Pei, that Dr. Ogunaike talks about that you wanted to add a little bit more reflection to?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ogunaike, for your brilliant summary of, it was like really like post-coloniality 101. And then especially I appreciate you ended with the example of the Mongolian Empire, because like it's, you remind me of like this somehow like we have imperialist nostalgia and interreligious dialogue, especially in the United States, has been operated on this imperialist nostalgia. And certainly we talk a lot about United States as a settler colonialist state, and then Asian Americans become part of the settler colonialism. And yet we destroyed Native American sacred places and people. And then now these Native American religions and spiritualities have become commodified. And then we have this romantic feelings toward what America has destroyed. And when you just talked about this, the story of a Mongolian Empire, on the one hand, that it just on the one hand, I thought about this American imperialism, and at the same time, this imperialist desire is not something simply American or Western. It perhaps like this imperialist desire can be found in various geographic locations and politics and religious histories. And then if we pursue genuine interreligious dialogue and genuinely trying to decolonize interreligious dialogue, again, as you emphasize the importance of critical self-reflection, we have to look deeply into our own traditions, how our own traditions and cultures have been deeply embedded in this imperialist desire and also imperialist nostalgia. So it's just my reflection.
Thanks. I agree with that wholeheartedly. There's long traditions of I mean, I don't know about all traditions, but the ones I study of dissident, anti-imperial works within various Islamic communities. So in West Africa, they had an interesting, in a lot of Muslim communities, you had, or Muslim states, you had state-sponsored scholars, Islamic scholars, right? In West Africa, they did not. There was a strong principle. I mean, they had a little bit, but the ideal was if you're a scholar, you stay as far away from the state as possible because the state corrupts. The Ibn Khaldun defined the government as an institution that prevents injustice other than that which it commits. And that was kind of the view amongst West African scholars. The state is necessary. So it actually was kind of helpful when we got colonized because scholars didn't get their funding and support from the state. When the state was colonized, it didn't affect them as much because they were financially and structurally independent. So you had, whereas in Egypt, Syria, and other places, major, major disruptions that came with colonization and especially nationalization afterwards. Same things didn't happen in West Africa. And you had these kind of dissident traditions. But I would also say, just like all universalisms aren't the same, all imperialisms are not the same as well, too. Right. So you have a Mongol imperialism, which, like, as long as you pay your taxes and so, like, they don't care. You practice whatever. Like, it's a very different. Even Roman imperialism, which is a bit more hardcore, is different. Islamic imperialism in its various forms is also different from Christian imperialism, in that religious pluralism was kind of seen as a given and even divinely ordained according to certain verses of the Quran. And so you don't have the same homogenizing tendencies really up until the 20th century. So religious pluralism wasn't a problem to be solved. So yeah, it's not necessarily nostalgia for imperialism, but not all imperialisms are the same, especially when it comes to interreligious dialogue, debate, understanding, notions of pluralism. Yoruba, traditional Yoruba, like pre-Christian, pre-Islamic empires, did a lot of shady, horrible stuff, a lot of slave trading, but there was no, they didn't, it was religious difference was expected. They really didn't care what you practiced as long as you paid your taxes. And so it's a very different kind of model, and understanding. And for me, it's really this, what's one of the things that's really key is this particular, so like Chinua Achebe said, to send missionaries to somebody to tell them that they've been worshiping their gods wrong is the height of insanity for a traditional Igbo person. It can't even be imagined within that cosmology. So there's some really substantial differences in terms of the notion of, let's say, having a kind of inherently polycentric worldview in which you're like, okay, everybody has their god or their gods and their way of doing things, and they should do it as best as they can, versus others in which that particular then becomes a universal to which everybody has to conform. So that's a big difference, and that's one that I see happening within Western imperialism, particularly modern colonialism. That happens that you don't see as much in the older empires, despite all the other nasty stuff that they did. They didn't do that one.
Thank you for these reflections. You know, there's just some questions that have come through, and you know, we obviously there's folks in the audience that are involved in interreligious dialogue, and rightfully so. And you know, we can, you know, celebrate that. You both have talked, you know, in some substantive technical ways about what the issues of coloniality are and how to think about decoloniality. And I'm wondering, you know, as a way to help us, um, you know, because you two are way smarter than I am in this, and and I'm just following along with you both in terms of what does that mean, you know, for everyday dialogue, right? Like we get to be in the halls of academia, right? And we have that privilege, and we can write about this stuff and think about it. And what about the local church, right? What about the local parish? What about the local mosque, right? And or the synagogue, right? Or the temple, and people that mean well, but because we are all operating in a system that has inculcated us with a colonial framework and a colonial language, right? How would you help us to be aware of that and kind of think through that? Like, for example, Catholic social teaching talks about four modes of dialogue, right? Dialogue of action, dialogue of life, dialogue of religious experience, and then dialogue of theological exchange, right? And a lot of times the theological exchange is happening in the halls of academy, but they're actually happening when people talk to each other, like, oh, you fast during Ramadan, like, what is that all about, right? And that's a theological one too. So these categories aren't neatly separated. um so how do folks that generally want to be in interreligious dialogue are sensitive to these colonial legacies that you both are articulating so sharply and offering these kind of solutions? Can you, in very practical terms, what does that look like? And both of you can, talk about
Okay,
that.
I'll so I mean, so decolonization, I meant to say this before, but I forgot. Uh, really just mean the undoing of these colonial dynamics. I mean, these days it's become a buzzword for like everything. It's like people talking about decolonize HR. I have no idea what that means, right? But in the terms that we're talking about, the dynamics of coloniality, undoing those. So that means undoing unjust power relations, undoing unjust knowledge relations and practices, and undoing the unjust psychological dynamics and traumas even that result from that on both sides, right? On both, like Baldwin said, what racism did to white Southerners was way worse than what it did to black people, right? This traumas and the thinking that you're the center of history, only God loves you. That's a weird thing, right? You
Mhm,
shouldn't think only loves you. That's
mhm,
you got some healing to do if you think that, right? So
mhm,
undoing those things, that's the work of decolonization, and that's work that's political work, that's economic work, that's undoing the current unjust structure of the world. So that's on
mhm,
the macro level, being committed to justice socially, locally, globally, nationally, etc. Right? Undoing these systems that perpetuate and create these vast and justify these vastly unjust. Why are these people poor? Oh, because they're lazy. Oh, because they're backwards. That's insane. Most of the time they're poor because they're getting robbed.
mhm,
Right? So that's on the macro level. On the micro level, then a concomitant of that, or something that goes along with that, is understanding that you have blind spots. There are things that you don't know that other people know. Other people who uh, coloniality, power relations can often work like a two-way mirror, right? So Du Bois said of in his Souls of White Folk, which is not as read as the Souls as Black Folk, but it's really insightful. He said, "I see white people undressed from the back and from the side." I mean, the experience of Black Americans was they know white people, they know what they have to, right, in order to survive, but it doesn't work the other way,
mhm,
right? So oftentimes people who are in a position, who are deprived, minoritized, whatever, in order to engage, survive, they have to know the dominant culture, but the dominant culture doesn't have to know them.
mhm,
Right? You think about people who are bilingual. If you're Anglo and you're in the US, you're not going to be bilingual. You're just going to speak English. Right? But if you come to the US speaking another, you better learn English quick. You're going to be bilingual. Right? So
mhm,
you understanding that these relations create some blind spots for you in whatever position you're in, and that therefore you have something to learn from your dialogue partner.
mhm,
And you have something to learn about the world, about reality, about God, and about yourself. Because none of us is an island. Who we are, our positions, our experiences are directly related to the positions and the experiences of other people.
mhm,
Right? I teach at the University of Virginia. The money that built my office and one of the buildings I'm in was built by enslaved people. and the descendants of those enslaved people are in Charlottesville. Their position in Charlottesville, their social, economic, psychological position, is connected to my position as a professor in the university.
Mhm.
I have a lot to learn about myself from talking to them and their experiences.
Mhm.
Right? So having this kind of openness and realizing I actually have something to learn, not only about them, about the other, but about myself, where I come from, who I am, how I've learned to see things, really about everything, about reality, about God. So engaging with people as mutual students,
Mhm.
mutual students. I learn from you, and maybe if I'm lucky, you learn from me too.
Right.
That kind of humility is sorely needed, and is often really lacking. Unfortunately, I found a lot of interfaith dialogues, or interfaith, interreligious, whatever the term is, are like attempts for like mutual conversion, or one upsmanship or showmanship, or some forms more subtle, some forms more gross. But unfortunately, it's relatively rare where there's a real genuine desire not to just learn about the other as an other, but to learn from people. You know some stuff that I don't know that I need to know.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I teach at Dominican University in Chicago in a series called Tent of Abraham. And it is a group of Jewish, Catholic mostly, and Muslim scholars from here in the city who got together after 9/11. I personally received a phone call from Cardinal Francis George's office to say, show up at a meeting at the Jewish committee here in Chicago, and bring 2 IDs with my picture on it, because there were guns in the front door. So I had to show up that way. And the only order I got from the Cardinal at the time was talk, because I asked, what do you want me to do? I was scared to death. Anyway, that was the first experience of people coming together at a very basic, almost like a pretext of danger in Chicago at the time because of 9/11. 25 years later, we formed the Chicago Coalition for Interreligious Learning, and we follow principles that we developed that attempt at decolonialization at the very basic level of conversation. We don't even call it dialogue, we call it learning. And before dialogue, that's what has to happen. To me, dialogue is up, down. And in the Catholic Church framework, the Catholic Church of the 1960s was, I'm right and you're wrong. I'm alive and you're dead. It is simple as that. And of course, that construct still exists today. It hasn't gone away. But I just want to say out loud that we have learned so much from each other, and we're in the process of writing a book that's going to be published by ICRA. I don't know, Saeed, if you know that. ICRA
Need to read.
Publications in
Right.
in Skokie. That's where we meet. Anyway, just to say that out loud is one thing. Another thing is I worked for 12 years in West Africa. So, Ogonyaike, you are meeting a person who did work in the Igbo land.
Okay.
So I was Onya Uche,
Okay.
white
Kedu.
skin.
Yeah.
That was how I was known. No name, just Onya Uche. So that idea of learning from the very basic experiences of life is just so important to understand how we can listen to each other from the anti-colonial perspective, that we really we don't know much about yet, but we've got to learn it, and we're learning it from you, Christine, and from you as well.
Thank you.
That's all I
Thank you.
want to say.
Thank you so much. Christine, did you want to respond either to Esther or to Oludamini, or any other thoughts that you may have as to where the discussion is going so far, or has gone to?
Yeah, I loved listening to Esther's story, and it's a great example. And also Oludamini's emphasis on self-reflection and self-rediscovery. It's much about like interreligious dialogue. It's more about learning yourself rather
Mhm.
than learning other people.
Mhm.
And I can just share one anecdote. I was once invited to deliver a lecture on the American religious history or history of religious pluralism in the United States. And because of my academic orientation, I talked about how this country was constructed upon the blood of Native Americans and all things. And then I also talked about like Asian Americans have been discriminated based on their religion because like Hindus and Muslims were denied their citizenship and naturalization based on not only based on their race but also based on their religion. So then after the talk, I felt good about myself. But then the person who invited me to the lecture just volunteered to walk to me. And he's a Muslim. He is Muslim, still Muslim. And then he works for the engineering company. And it was like he kind of formed this interfaith kind of club at his organization. And then when we walked to parking lot, he said, your lecture was great, but you criticized Christians too much. But that's okay. I feel bad, but that's okay because that's also the part of reality and history of the United States. So, and I was at first I didn't understand what he meant, but then gradually I realized my lecture, even if told I spoke about the American religious history from a post-colonial and decolonial perspective, and my type of lecture was not relevant to the context they live in and they work in. So since then, they have not invited me again. But if they ever invited me again, I feel like I can deliver different kinds of American religious histories, namely how like religiously different people and racially different people can work together and create a solidarity against oppression and imperialism, just as Esther shared her experience.
Yeah.
So it's like in the early 20th century, when Asian Americans were denied having any property in California, those like South Asian men, and then also interracial marriage was illegal in California. South Asian men intentionally married Mexican women, and because Mexican women were recognized as American citizens based on like Hidalgo Treaty. So it was like they outsmarted the legal system, and then in that way, through the marriage, they could protect their private property. And at the same time, this marriage was not simply marriage; it was like actually interreligious marriage. So on a really communal level and on a church level, and I feel like we pay more attention to how ordinary people share their city together and how they interact with each other when they send their children to school and meeting other parents who practice different religions. But still, we have a lot to do because the social structures create these genuine interpersonal relations and interactions into kind of like evil prejudice and things like that. Oh, I have more to think about, but
Yeah. So there's two questions, and before I ask that, I'm going to ask a question, and we're at 8 o'clock, and I just, if I can humbly ask if you guys can stay on. So the first thing that I want to ask is, and then ask the two other questions, or have them ask the persons who would like to, is that Atalia Omer, in her book Decolonizing Religion, Peace Building, she talks about something called the harmony business, right? And that interreligious dialogue is this thing about how do we harmonize folks coming from different religious traditions, and in that project, instead, the harmony is really how do we end up ostensibly conforming one group of people belong to one religious tradition to another group, something that Oludamini and Christine, you both talk about, and kind of even in Christine, in your anecdotal story, they were probably upset at you because you weren't doing the harmony business kind of a thing, right? And so Aaron Dunn, he wrote an article recently in Journal of Interreligious Studies, and he talks about this idea of how do you do dialogue on points of differences. And that's something that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that, does bridge building has to always have to be predicated on the idea that, well, you find a common ground and you just keep working on that and you keep building on that and you keep doing that, instead of getting to like the meaty stuff. And it's not about converting somebody else, but it's really understanding somebody belong to a tradition on their own terms, which can necessarily be in conflict with your own religious beliefs. And so it's harmony, but it's in a different type of harmony, right? It's not about commonalities any longer. Do you guys think that this is possible, especially when there's rhetoric around that, well, we need to get to know one another before we can have the hard talks, right? But when do we get to know one another? When do the interlocutors get to say, well, I know you enough now to really ask the tough question, right? And so that time horizon sometimes shunts the ability to have the tough conversation that is going to be decolonizing the conversation, and you end up then perpetuating the colonial type of conversation. So I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think about this idea of this harmony business and pushing back against this idea? Well, interest dialogue is about like, can we get along because we share similar ethical or something like that precepts, and leave it there.
Yes. So the harmony, she looked at one really illustrative example. She looked at the Philippines in her book,
That's right.
and at especially South Philippines, Mindanao, where you have that's where the Muslim minority is, and you also have a lot of indigenous people there, right? And the harmony business essentially is, how can we make you guys okay with your oppression, right? How can we make it so you guys don't buck, right? So with the example of 9/11, these other things that happen, or like, the Israel Palestine today. It's like, okay, so we're gonna have interreligious dialogue so we can find common ground to support the status quo. If the status quo is a gun to my head and a boot on my neck, that's insupportable. That has to change. If we're gonna have any kind of conversation, what kind of dialogue is it if you're holding a gun to my head and I'm sitting there with a pencil trying to talk to you about the fine points of, you know, uh, abrogation or non-abrogation in Islamic theology? That doesn't. I mean, so in the U.S. after 9/11, I mean, um, and this has been the case for indigenous people and black people and Asian, lots of people before. People can get disappeared and dead like that. Some people can call the cops on other people and they can disappear. And until you address those dynamics, that makes dialogue crazy. You can do it, but it's wild. There's no Faraday cages are these things that block out electromagnetic radiation. There's no Faraday cage for structural racism and oppression. There's no safe space that you can create. At any moment, anybody could call the cops on somebody, and then that's it. So this harmony business has to be seen in the context of the imperial projects, as Professor Pei talked about, that they're put in service of.
You're right.
Right. So
Right.
like a lot of early anthropological works, anthropologists were sent to Sudan and other places, the early anthropologists, on behalf of the colonial government to study the people and their religious customs and practices so that the colonial governments could better rule them. Or like, okay, which are the sacred mountains? Okay, so if we desecrate those, that's going to create a big havoc, and then we'll be able to conquer them. And right, so that's what a lot of the early anthropologists, who they had their own reasons, they had their own like sincere academic, but that's how their research was used. That's how they were deployed. And unfortunately, a lot of this harmony business, that's how it's deployed today. Right. So let's find some common ground so we can talk and make it's like Novocaine. You got a boot on your neck. Let me give you this Novocaine harmony so that you're okay with all the terrible stuff that's being done to you and your people. That's a dead end. Now, in terms of practically, you guys are in Chicago, you're meeting with people, what do you do? When do you ask the tough questions? I mean, one of the things is it's an odd, from certain perspectives, starting point to see religious pluralism and difference as a problem that has to be solved.
Right.
Right? There's this kind of starting point that, okay, we need to find common ground.
Right.
We need to all agree on as many things as possible. Why? There are lots of different starting grounds. So, the Quran is like Surah Ma'idah. We've appointed a divine law, Sharia, for each one of you. And if God willed, we could have made you one community, but we didn't. So we made you different people. So compete with one another in good works.
Right.
And then when you die, God will let you know about what you differ. Right. So this is religious pluralism a problem or a plenitude? Is it something, one of the glories of God's creation, or is it a problem to be solved?
Right.
That's a very different way of looking. If you look at, okay, it's a problem to be solved, then we need to get everybody on the same page. That's a kind of, I view it as like a false universalism. So one of my favorite quotes, if you indulge me, let me read it to find it here. Aimé Césaire, a great Martinican theorist. He was Fanon's high school teacher in Martinique. He said there are two paths to doom. One by segregation, by walling yourself up in a particular, or by dilution. The other is by dilution, by thinning off into the emptiness of a universal. But I have a different idea of a universal. It's a universal rich with all that is particular, rich with all the particulars that there are, the deepening of each particular, the coexistence of them all.
Right.
That's a very different understanding of universal, of we don't all have to agree on everything. We can come to understand our differences and appreciate them as a plenitude rather than a problem.
Right. Thank you. Christine, your thoughts on this harmony business and how to think about interreligious interactions from a standpoint of doing it differently, rather than waiting about like finding, building deep relationships to be able to talk about tough stuff.
So I read Atalia Omer's book and wrote a short article in response to her book. And I have been thinking a lot about the book, especially the harmony business. And what I agree with her. I agree with her critique of harmony business. Harmony business is a product of neoliberal approach to interreligious dialogue, especially done by large NGOs who always need projects and funding resources. And then to continue to fund their programs, they have to run this interreligious dialogue in a peaceful way. And at the same time, and I just think about the context of Mindanao, they just got out of this civil war, and any kind of conflict, even like interreligious conflict, and even if it's small, it could create like a full-blown armed conflict there. So I feel like how to skillfully manage interreligious dialogue beyond the harmony toward like long-term and sustainable peace is always challenging in many like post-war zone and post-conflict zone. And then how can we do it? Sorry, what was the second part of the question? I was too
like
much
here,
into
and
the harmony
no,
business.
just no problem. No, practically speaking, if many times the telos of dialogue, even here in the United States, so it's not just in a conflict zone, right? But even here in the US, this idea of being in this harmony business, right? And that this idea that we're always looking for commonalities as points, as ways of bridge building, but and that if we're going to talk about have tough conversations, or have substantive conversations about religious differences, we have to develop long-term relations. Like how do we tackle this, right? Like clearly you disagree with the harmony business approach, but that's like that's what's really done all the time, right? And so, or most of
Yeah.
the time, I would argue. And so, where do we go from there? Especially if the idea of having tough conversations is predicated on the fact that you have to have some sort of like longitudinal reproach, a longitudinal relationship with your interlocutor.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in. Like you said, uh, not in a conflict zone. The U.S. is a big conflict zone,
Sorry, yes, I was saying,
especially
Yeah.
no,
for a lot of people. If you're Indigenous American, it's a hell of a conflict zone.
you're
Black
absolutely right.
Americans in certain parts of the country poor people. It's a conflict. Lots of people. The U.S. is a heavy, especially now. It's a really heavy conflict zone. Um,
That is a good corrective. I was literally
Yeah.
thinking about bombs, and even that can be talked about in this way. But thank you for that. That's an important one. Yes. So go ahead.
So in Omel's book, she actually she brings like gender and sexuality that have been ignored in interreligious dialogue, and then she emphasizes like the colonial way of interreligious dialogue must engage in difficult and challenging topics, especially gender and sexuality, that almost all religions have ignored in many ways. And then that raises another question. If we create some kind of like a queer space or feminist space where religious and non-religious or religiously diverse people participate, whether that kind of space can create genuine dialogue where difficult questions can be addressed. Honestly, possible but impossible at the same time because a lot of socially, economically, and racially and sexually marginalized people are traumatized by institutionalized religion. And then once those marginalized people entered even tough space marked by gender, sexuality, and so on, still it's difficult to bring their faith or their religious practices or spirituality into this space.
Mhm.
Honestly, I don't know. I'm still looking for a possible way. So if you
Mhm.
find one, and let me know. And Ulu Damini, do you have any?
yeah. So one of the things that comes up with this is just like there are different universalisms, there are different whole discussions of gender and sexuality in completely different categories and terms in different cultures and traditions. So you
That's
have
right.
like Hijra, third gender in South Asia, and then in South Asia is mediated by things like caste. And so they're just like whole different categories. Even there's my advisor at Harvard, he works on logic mainly, but his first book was Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World, because people treat homosexuality as this universal term, but it's really a Northern European post 19th century formation,
That's right.
right? And like it's still in a lot of the Latin world or the Roman Empire or other places, and like the Islamic world was more about top or bottom. Like they had very different sexual categories, very different norms, very different laws and discussions about it. And it's with again the imposition of this particular. There's a kind of feminist imperialism, even a queer imperialism. I was giving a lecture in Canada one time at University of Lethbridge, and there was this Indigenous student who came to me, and he was like, "Yeah, all the LGBTQ clubs keep trying to tell me I'm LGBTQ. I'm not LGBTQ. I'm two spirited. Like
Mhm.
this is not who I know who I am. Like everybody in my tribe knows who I am, knows what I am. They keep trying to tell me I'm this. I'm not this." And I said,
Mhm.
"Yeah, you are what you are." Um,
Mhm.
so for me anyway, and Sylvia Winters and other Black feminist scholars, third wave, fourth wave, not sure which wave we're on now. Others have done great work on this, criticizing the ways in which feminist and even queer scholarship can get caught up in, and movements can get caught up in these movements of coloniality and
Mhm.
repress, erase. So it's tough. But I think one of the big things is listening, learning, um, and understanding you don't know everything. A lot of the categories and things you take for granted can and should be challenged when you move into other contexts. And understanding the histories of these terms and these movements, that can sometimes help to make space, but it's hard. It's like the only way to really do this is to like fix the whole world, and then you can do it. But obviously, we can't wait, as you said, to fix the whole world. So I think you kind of have to do both simultaneously. You have to try to work on the big macro issues and then talk to people and learn from people on the little local issues. And honestly, I think, Christine, like you've pointed this out in your own work, like a lot of this people are kind of already doing on the ground in different ways. And we just kind of have to pay attention to the things that are happening around family dinner tables, at bodegas, at community centers, and things like that, in which we have people actually engaging in really substantive, mutual understandings of each other and solidarity building and these kinds of things. And often it's happening amongst the people who it's not being funded by NGOs. It's not that it's not being done at universities or things like that. It's being done by people who need to band together to survive in the face of really serious situations. And out of that necessity, they build solidarity and they build mutual understanding, and they do things that work, and they create spaces that are powerful and transformative. And so learning from that, I think, is something we can really do.
Good. I know we're like way over time. I just want to give Chrissy the opportunity to ask a question because she had been waiting patiently as well, and she wanted to ask. So Chrissy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Said. Thank you, both of you presenters, for your great presentation. Both of you, at different points in your presentation, mentioned something about the hope that interreligious dialogue would move beyond the actual action of dialogue into something else, whether it be dance, something beyond the spoken word. And so I just wondered if you could give us glimpses of where you see that working well. I was just with with my family at the No Kings protest on Saturday. And so and one level, the signs, the music, the movement, like that's one glimpse I could see. But I just wonder if you might offer some ways too that you feel beyond the spoken word we could move in this way.
Okay, I have some interesting examples, I guess. So, my people, the Yoruba people in Nigeria, are notoriously religiously promiscuous. They say the Yoruba people are 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, and 50% still practice traditional religion. That adds up to more than 150%. Right? People, when I was a kid, our landlady in Lagos, Alaja, she'd been on Hajj. She's a Muslim. She prayed 5 times a day. She'd go to Christian revival meetings, and she'd also have the Babalao come bury stuff in our yard. I'm not saying this as necessarily as a model, but this is so. What happens often, less so now, unfortunately, but I had a friend who fell very ill, and people suspected somebody had done like bad magic on him. So the Muslim, the Sufi sheikhs, the priests, and Christian pastors, prophets, all came together to pray and undo whatever bad spells. And this happens all the time. Different religious specialists will come together to pray or solve a problem. Or there's one town, my uncle's town, everybody in the town, Muslim, Christian, and people who practice traditional religion, and people who did kind of all of the above, banded together to send the Imam on Hajj, because he's going to bring back barakah for all of us. And people,
Barakah meaning blessing.
Blessing. And everybody participated in building the church, because they're like, this is going to bring blessing and sacred presence for everybody in the village. So that's one kind of form of ecumenical understanding, whether it's undoing bad magic or getting together to send people, just an understanding blessing is blessing. We'll take it from wherever we can get it. There's Yoruba proverb says the marketplace has more than one entrance. Other great dialogues is a Sufi sheikh I know who met Hindu sage pundit in Benares, and the two of them just sat and stared at each other in silence for about 30 minutes And then each one of them, you were asked about their meeting with the other, and they were like, "Yeah, we're really happy to see. I don't know how they did it, but we can see the deepest truths of realizations in that tradition are the deepest ones of mine." Or things like Hindustani classical music, like Ravi Shankar. That whole tradition is like a blending of Islamic and right. So Ravi Shankar's guru, his master, was Ustad Alaraka, he's a Muslim. Right. So there's this incredible musical exchange and dialogue. North Indian classical music is the result of that marriage. So it happens with, even in Yoruba, a lot of our vocal traditions that Christians use, that Muslims use, that even indigenous practitioners use, are influenced by a fusion of all of these three traditions. Right? So Muslim prayers and Muslim praise songs have a little bit of influence from Christian gospel, a lot of influence from traditional things. And then even traditional prayers, the way in which they sing it is influenced by Muslim vocal styles, melisma and things like that. So there are kinds of ways in which there's a kind of, I recognize you've got something good. I want to learn from you.
Yeah.
Let's make something beautiful together, whether it's music, architecture, clothing. What you think of as West African clothing, the embroidery on most West African clothing comes from Islamic talismans. Everybody wears it, Muslim, Christian, everybody, but it's anyway. So there are all kinds of interesting examples, but the silent one is very interesting, and then the musical one I think is also really telling. There's been some interest. There's in Detroit actually. There's a sheikh from Tijani Sufi sheikh from Ghana, who has like they sing Arabic poems, but it's almost like gospel style. It's really so there are all of these really interesting exchanges that and this is the way things have always happened. Like, I don't know if you've read this book, Stealing from the Saracens, but Gothic architecture, right? People say that's Saracen architecture, and even Christopher Lloyd Wright, yeah, the famous architect, so they said it's Saracen architecture, right? They took inspiration, all these techniques, maybe even some Muslim architects. So this learning from each other what's best, and then trying to do things as best as we can. That's another powerful form of dialogue, mutual understanding, mutual appreciation.
I think maybe the concept of the tent. We are all under the tent. We have to figure out how to understand belonging to the tent and creating a different language around that rather than the traditional languages of domination.
Thank you. Yeah,
Because I
Christine.
think that's what you're talking about.
Christine?
I certainly agree with Ulu Damini about the power of silence, because like silence was the most powerful interfaith dialogue slash activism I experienced. That's how I started thinking about interfaith dialogue as a social activism done in silence. And like many years ago, I was part of this the women's group for the international, like a women's partnership for international peacemaking. It's Buddhism-based organization. And then it had like a 10-day silent retreat for social activists from all around the world. And then a lot of women were traumatized by civil war and sex trafficking and many issues. And then these social activists have regularly met people traumatized by structural violence, and they were kind of internalized with the violence as they just encounter this violence every day. And all that we did was actually we woke up in the morning together, and then we had a breakfast. We started like our morning with walking meditation in silence, and then we sat together in silence and we ate breakfast together, and then we did like meditation together, and we did yoga together, again walking meditation, and we washed our clothes together. Everything was done in silence as a group. And then there were times that we actually communicate. There was a time that we broke our silence only when we tried to analyze the structural violence behind the gender-based violence in different like contexts and cultures. In that way, like we could understand each other more deeply, and at the end of our gathering, we became everyone's best friend, and it was also very it was moving and very touching that a lot of Christian women and Muslim women were reluctant to participate in like a Buddhist way of meditation. And then our leader, who was a Buddhist lay leader, and she was very careful to create the silent the space for silent meditation. But certainly, I feel like it was possible because it was organized in Buddhist tradition, and Buddhism does not have any like divine or godly figure in their tradition. I guess that's why it was possible. So sometimes I imagine that no king's protests. What if these all protesters use silence actively, and because in China, there was a like a white paper protest that they're wearing white mask and then just hold the white papers. I feel like that was more impactful. Oh, when these politicians just shouted to socially marginalized people, we don't need to shout back at them. We can use our silence and our like walking meditation and our bodies. We put our bodies into the protest space. So I feel like that once I wrote about interreligious dialogue as a social activism and how social activism can create space for interreligious dialogue beyond just a simple language and words. I don't know, Christina, just if you have any that successful story of a silent protest and march, let me know. I want to hear about it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, both of those responses were wonderful. There was one thing we did at CTU with our students called social presencing theater. And it was a time where the Maryknoll fathers put it on, but it was people moved around the room in silence based on the questions that were being asked and how they positioned themselves. And that was one example that I know that we did with our students that was profoundly impactful for them in that moment as well. But I was just really touched. Both of you had mentioned that, the ability to move in dialogue that doesn't use the spoken word. And I just appreciate you adding a little more context to both of those conversations. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's more questions, but I'm glad that I already offered you the honorariums because you've already agreed and this is way over time. So thank you so much to both Olutamini and Christine for doing this. This has been incredible. I have so many questions. We have a bunch of questions. I think that, for those who would like to, please, both Dr. Christine Pays and Dr. Odamini Oganaike's information is available at the school, Denison University and University of Virginia website, respectively, and you can email them directly. You can also email me. We will have this this program tonight. It's being recorded, so it will be put up on video soon at Learn at CTU. And thank you all for staying longer. Thank you again to both you, Damini and Christine. It was so insightful. I learned a ton, and I'm really this is a project that I'm working on myself, and given a lot. You both have given me, and I hope others, a lot to think about, that truly want to be in interreligious spaces and in relationship with those that are not just like themselves, right? And I think that this was really great for that. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I want to thank Peter Cunningham for handling the Zoom for tonight. Really appreciate you staying as well later on and half an hour over. And thank you everyone else. And so with that, I bid everyone a great night and God bless to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.